And welcome back to the Nose Plays Endless Space 2. Tonight I'm going to take just a few minutes to do something that I've been meaning to do for some time now. And that is record a quick video that goes over ship design and the different details about ships that are not very intuitive in this game that many players have been requesting from a lot of YouTubers, myself included. Now, I have done a series of videos that goes over this in the past. You can watch those. They are actually gameplay videos where I take a few minutes out of each gameplay segment and specifically go over ship design. This video is going to be a little different because it's going to be entirely about ship design, and I'm going to try to cram everything I know about ships into this one video. So, I've loaded up a game with the United Empire where I have all the ship types unlocked, and I've entered the ship designer where you can create your own ship designs. And this is an important feature in the game that you need to at some point become familiar with, because there's a lot of really cool stuff that you can do with your ships once you get comfortable and understand how they work. So to get to here, I'm going to jump out real quick and show you. All you got to do is go to the military status page, which is F5 if you're using the shortcut, or the little symbol up here at the top of the screen. And then these are all of the ship designs that you currently have. Most of these ship designs are default ship designs. You can actually delete these entirely if you don't want to use the default designs, or you can just continually upgrade them and get different versions, version 1, version 5, version 3, version 2. But you can also create completely new ships like we did here. So this was our original settler design. We created these demolisher ships. These ships are specifically designed with, I believe, titanium modules. Yeah, titanium A2S slugs. And this helps siege planet defenses down more quickly. And the way that I created this ship, and what we're going to talk about, is this button right here in the middle, which is the create button. So if you click that create button, it'll take you to this screen. And this screen allows you to then create new ship designs. The first thing that you'll want to do is give your new ship design a name, and hopefully you name it something that is relevant to the actual design. We're just going to call it Nose Ships. And we're going to start by opening this up. And as you can see, I have a lot of different class designs. The names of these ship class designs are completely dependent on your faction, and every faction will have the same designs. There's almost nothing unique about them in terms of the classes themselves and the statistics, but they will have different names. And so I'm just going to mouse over each one real quick and show you which ship designs we have currently available to us. So the first hull type is the attacker class. It is the small attacker class ship. Costs 1 command point in a fleet, and it is only 150 industry to craft that chassis. We also have the protector class, which is the defensive version of this ship. It is also small, 1 command point, and 150 industry to create. The next one is our colony ship. This is a colonizer-based ship. This is the only ship type, I believe, that can equip a colony probe. But there are some other things that you can do with these ship designs. They tend to have fewer slots for weapons, and sometimes no weapons at all. But some chassis do actually provide weapon slots. And so there are some unique things that you can do depending on what faction you're using with this colony chassis type. So we'll take a look at that one in a moment. The next one is the one that you're probably most familiar with, because this is the one that you start with in most games with most factions, and that is your exploration class ship. This ship is small and 1 command point, usually has a little bit of weaponry available to it. and is very, very fast compared to other ships. And we'll talk about why that is in a little bit. The next two are the medium class ships. There are two types of medium class ships. There's the Hunter class ship. These ships are more offensively oriented ships typically. And then there is the defensive coordinator class. These ships are more defensive in nature and provide lots of extra support module slots so that you can bring extra fleet-wide support or extra things like titanium slugs or more manpower. So all kinds of neat stuff there. And then we have the final class of ship, the carrier class. This is the large class of ship. Carriers are extremely powerful ships with lots and lots of hull points. They're very difficult to bring down without the right kinds of weaponry. But we'll talk about what you need to do to deal with them. They're also extremely expensive, almost 10 times the cost of a small ship. But they are very, very powerful. So let's start with the colonizer class ship. Let's talk a little bit about how this works. So when you create a new ship, you got to start with a new name. It'll always force you to create a new name. If you're having trouble hitting the create design button, it's probably because you forgot to name your ship type, or you haven't given it a unique name. Now, this ship actually has 3 support class modules and a single offensive module. It is the only class of ship that can carry this module, the basic colony module, and you can only ever carry one of them. But you are not required to carry a colony module, and you can actually outfit this ship in a number of different ways. For example, if you just want a cheap ship that can provide your entire fleet with a little bit of stealth, you can throw one of these probes on there. These cloaker modules will give your entire fleet cloaking as long as this ship is alive. And you can even provide it with a little bit of weaponry, maybe, I don't know, some defense or some repair. One of these modules that lowers the chance to be targeted, something like that. This ship design could be really useful in providing your fleet with a cloaking ship, and a very cheap cloaking ship with only 320 industry to construct and 1 command point worth of fleet. So this is just one thing you can do with your ships. Now there's a couple of important things to notice. This button up here, in my opinion, should always be activated. By default it is not. So one of the very first things you're going to want to do is activate this button. We'll talk a little bit about why. But before we get to that, let's just go through some of the stats of the ship. So the first statistic is the health of the ship. These ships have 1500 health, 40 manpower, a movement of 3, and take up 1 command point. This is all pretty important stuff. And you'll see how this compares to other ships as we get further along. The real benefit to this ship is its really, really cheap construction cost. So you can crank these things out faster than you can a lot of other ships. Every faction is going to have slightly different designs for their colony ships. So not every colony ship is going to have 3 support modules and an attack module. Some colony ships are going to be much different. Some will have no attack modules at all. Some will be extremely limited in what you can do with them. But it's always a good idea to look at this chassis and think outside the box and see if maybe there's something unique that you can do with it, and then create a new ship design using this chassis for very cheap, expendable, but useful fleet ships. Okay, over here is a very important piece of information that you need to look at as well. So we looked at the basic stats of the ship, but over here we have the small class. This is what determines how many command points the ship takes. It also gives it a statistic called hull weakness 100, and that hull weakness of 100 is used in calculating defenses. So if you decide to put hull plating on a ship or shielding on a ship, percent reduction is based off of the hull weakness in part. So it's part of that calculation that calculates the percent of the absorbed damage. Higher numbers, I believe, are bad, which is kind of counterintuitive. But you'll see why when we get to the bigger ships. They have higher hull weakness. And that means that they're basically easier to get shots through the defenses. But it's kind of countered by the strength of the defenses. So we'll look at that. And then every ship gets two things that you need to be familiar with. One is a role and one is a bonus. So the role of this ship is Colonizer. Basically, it just tells you what you're supposed to do with this ship type typically, but that's not a box that you have to stay in. Like I said, we could use this to create siege modules. We could use it to make a cloaking ship. We could do a lot of stuff with this ship design. This bonus, however, is pretty important. So this gives +1 movement on the ship. Not real exciting, but some of the other bonuses are a lot more important. Again, the best thing about this ship class, this Colonizer ship class, is that it's very, very cheap compared to the other classes. Alright, let's go ahead and look at the most common ship type, the one that you start out with, your scout ship or your exploration class ship. Most factions will start with one or two of these ship designs. These ship designs pretty much always come with some type of weaponry available to them. However, the flexibility in their defenses, the number of support modules, and the number of weapons is quite different between different factions. Some factions only have one weapon slot available, some have two, some have a lot of support slots, some have very limited number of support slots. So again, the chassis of these designs can vary greatly in what you can outfit them with, but as far as the basic statistics, they're always going to be the same. So every faction's always going to start with an exploration ship with 1,500 hit points, 40 manpower, 4 movement speed base, 1 command point per ship. They will always start with the very fast bonus, and sometimes there are a few factions that actually have faction traits that increase this speed even higher. And then they will start with the explorer trait. And this is why you might notice when you put exploration probes on non-explorer ships, the recovery rate is slower on those ships than it is on explorer ships, because the recovery rate is increased by 100%. So they recover much, much more quickly on these ships. That means your probes come up faster than they normally would, and that is the major trait of this ship. So anytime you're using this chassis, it generally benefits you to run a probe module of some sort on it, but you don't have to. You can run any types of support modules, weapon modules, defense modules that you're capable of outfitting on these ships. Now, these ships don't make great offensive ships typically, and we'll talk a little bit about why the comparison between these and the actual Tier 2 offensive ships is so great, even though it doesn't seem like it. But one thing that I want to show you is when you put weapons on here, you're going to see some numbers. And when you turn this detailed thing off and you look at these numbers, you're going to get a sense of what weapons are best, but you're not going to actually get a sense of what weapons are best. For example, if I just look at guns versus missiles, well, missiles do 61 damage per second, guns do 180, so clearly guns are the better weapon, right? And that is completely incorrect. And let me show you why. I'll throw 2 guns on here, and you can see by adding this detailed section, I can see right here that at long range, my guns are actually only dealing 8 damage per second, 39 damage per second at medium range, and 67 damage per second at short range. So despite the fact that these guns, I read 180 earlier for the flak defense. We'll talk about that later. The damage per second is 39. So 39 versus 61. Missiles look better. But when we look at this, we see that we get up to 67 at short range with these versus missiles, which if we put 2 missiles in here, you can see that at short range, missile damage falls off greatly because the accuracy of missiles decreases significantly. So it's not as clear-cut as what the battle card over here in the corner says. This battle card is basically predicting like 100% accuracy essentially. And so these missiles are going to be much different depending on what range you're actually engaging at. So knowing your optimal fleet engagement is important, and the only way to know that is by using the detailed stats when you build your ships. So if you want a ship that's really good at fighting at long range, you're going to need to build weaponry that's good at long range. If you want to build a fleet that's good at short range or medium range, you'll need to accommodate it with weapons that are ideal for those ranges. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about why this is important. Let's talk a little bit about what the defenses do. So when I put a defensive module on here, this statistic is created, and it's based on the value of the module itself multiplied or divided in some combination of math that you can see on the screen here with that hull weakness to give you the 33% number. That number increases or decreases not linearly when you add more modules. So if I add a second defensive module, you can see we went up to 50, not to 66%. So it's not a linear increase by doing multiple modules of the same type. However, the more of them you stack, the better this statistic will get. And it does kind of top out at a particular range depending on the ship type. Similar things are true for shields. So you can see if I put my first one down, my value is 71. If I put my second one down, it only goes up to 83%. The big difference being the amount of shielding does go up significantly, but the actual absorption of the shields stays pretty similar to one shield. And so this is another thing explaining how stacking a particular defense does not necessarily work the way that you might think it would. It's not a linear relationship, it's a non-linear relationship, and so you get reduced returns. Okay, we went over some of those basics. I'm going to save talking about some of these things for a little bit later. The one thing that I want to point out here is we're going to do just a quick test with bullet. Actually, let's get a bigger number. Titanium missiles, maybe? This will work. Alright. I want a bigger number so I can show you something. So, 2 titanium missiles is 126 damage at long range. That's the main thing that I want to point out right now. 126 damage. Okay. Now we're going to switch ship types, and we're going to look at the attacker class. So the attacker class looks very similar, both in its physical model and in a lot of other ways. But there are a few differences. This is a Tier 2 science tech. When you research the first tech of ships in the left quadrant of the science wheel, you unlock 2 ship chassis. You unlock the attacker and the protector class of ships. The big difference between these and the ones that we just looked at is, number one, they have approximately 25% more health. So 500 more hit points, which is pretty useful. They also have more manpower. And if you mouse over this, you can see that manpower is important not only in ground battles, but having full manpower on a ship provides a 20% damage bonus to that ship's weaponry. It's unclear from the text how this actually works, other than it does work. It's not clear that if you lose one manpower, do you lose the entire 20%, or does it gradually decrease as the manpower decreases? My best guess is that as you reduce the amount of manpower on the ship, that 20% gets reduced. So for example, if I have 100 manpower on my ship and I lose 50 manpower, then my damage bonus would basically drop to approximately 10%. Hey Bob the Frog, you certainly did. This is actually a special stream where I'm talking explicitly about ship design and going over some of the details that I understand about it. So hopefully you'll enjoy this video once it's completed. And if you do have any thoughts on what I'm talking about or questions, feel free to jump in and maybe give me a chance to expand on some points that I'm not quite hitting. So right now we're talking about manpower and how manpower affects the damage of your ships, and why this class of attacker class ship is better than the basic explorer class ship. And the reason for that is you only start with 40 manpower versus 100. As you lose manpower to weapon fire, certain weapons will reduce the manpower on your ship. You'll lose that percent bonus faster. So that's the big change. So more hit points, more manpower. Those are two things in favor of these attacker class ships, which is why even if you have a large fleet of explorers with lots of guns, many times you'll lose to equally equipped ships. Now another thing that I want to point out is we did 2 of these on the previous ship. You'd think that 2 of these would have similar damage values, and you would be right, except for one little detail. You'll notice that before it was like 127, and now it's 138. So the damage has been enhanced here. And the reason that it's been enhanced is one of the bonuses on all attacker class ships is plus 10% damage on weapons. And this is always going to give attacker class ships an edge and an engagement with equally equipped ships. So for any encounter where you have the same number of ships with the same number of guns, similar class of weaponry, attacker class ships will always beat explorer class ships because of these reasons: the extra hit points, the extra manpower, and the percent bonus to damage. The further you get into the game, the more pronounced this becomes, because the weaponry gets more and more dangerous. It gets larger and larger damage values, and that damage value is then amplified by the percent bonus. And so if you're using really, really high tier weaponry in the military tree, this percent bonus is going to have a bigger and bigger impact. Where at the very beginning of the game, 10% on a small number is just a couple points of damage. It's just splitting hairs, really. And the real thing that's providing the advantage in those engagements is the hit points. There's one other factor that causes specifically attacker class ships to outclass explorer class ships and colony class ships in combat. And that is this particular trait right here. And what this does is it causes all of the attacker class ships to target a single target. And so they will always basically focus fire on a single target, where explorer class ships tend to just spray their fire randomly. And if you actually watch the battles, you'll see your explorer class ships will shoot at a single target for a while, then they'll change targets and shoot at a different one, then they'll change targets and shoot back at the first one, then they'll shoot at a third target, and they don't really focus their fire on any particular ship. They tend to spread the fire out evenly among all the ships. The side effect of that is that the ships in general tend to survive longer in combat than when you focus all of your fire on a single ship at a time. And so because explorer class ships spread their fire out over multiple targets, and they don't actually destroy targets very quickly, even though they're doing similar amounts of damage, they're spreading it out over all those health pools. They don't reduce the damage over the course of the engagement. While a bunch of attacker class ships will all focus one ship down, and then as soon as that ship's down, you've lost some of your firepower, and then they'll do the next ship, and then the next ship. And so that's why attacker class ships will almost always out-engage and out-duel explorer class ships that are being used in a military fashion. So if you're going to use explorer class ships as military ships, you're only able to do it under two circumstances. Number one, you can use them against other explorer class ships. That works perfectly fine, especially if you have explorer class ships with 2 gun slots. There are a lot of explorer class ships that only have 1, and so you already have an advantage in combat because of that if you equip your ships that way. The other circumstance is you really need to outnumber the attacker class ships significantly. It's almost, I want to say, 2 to 1. So in order to take on 2 attacker class ships, you really need to have 4 explorer class ships to be regularly successful. If you have anything less than that, you're probably going to lose the engagement, or maybe break even, but it's not going to go well for you either way. So that kind of wraps up my little spiel on these atomic class ships and why they so significantly outclass the explorer class ships, even when you seem to think that they wouldn't, because, hey, we have the same number of guns, we have the same number of ships, we should be relatively equal or close to equal in hit points, you know, so maybe we'll do okay. You're not going to do okay. You're going to lose more often than you win. There are also a number of attacker class ships like this one that can actually fit more weapons on them if they so choose. And so you're likely to be outgunned in many cases too. This isn't always the case, but it is for a few different factions. And the United Empire is one of those factions. Alright, let's take a look at the Protector class ship and what's special about these ships. These ships are really, really important for a number of reasons. First of all, there are a number of modules that can only be equipped on Protector or Coordinator class ships. So if you want to use them, you have to use these types of ships. Otherwise, they're kind of worthless. But more importantly, they have the most health out of all the early ships. So they have an extra 500 health compared to other ships. They also have the same amount of manpower as the previous attacker class ship, and they still only cost 1 command point, but they have some different abilities over here. So the Protector class ships primary targets are attackers and hunters. We'll talk about primary targets a little bit later, but basically every ship type has a primary target that they will try to focus on more often than they focus on other targets. And that can play a role in certain battles. The Guardian trait means that they attract fire, so they will be targeted more frequently than other classes of ships, and specifically things like the Explorer class ship that tends to just spray its fire all over the place. It will more frequently target a Protector than any other class due to this trait. It's not clear how much more it attracts the fire of those ships from this description, but it is significant. And then finally, defenses on plating and shields. So again, because of the extra health and because of defenses, if I put the same number of defensive modules on here as I did a ship like an Explorer class or a Colony class ship, this one's going to have significantly higher stats over here. And it has to do with the fact that we get this small 10% bonus, but as these plating and shield values get larger by moving up the military tree, the discrepancy gets larger and larger as well. And so these ships will always survive longer than just about anything else. There's not a whole lot else to say about these guys right now, but one thing that I would point out is that if you're building flotillas and you want your attack class weapons to survive longer, it's always a good idea to have a protector or a coordinator class ship in each flotilla, at least one. And what that does is at the beginning of the battle, they will absorb most of the fire like a shield, and they will allow your more offensively oriented attack class vessels to survive the first few minutes of combat and deal as much damage as possible. If you don't have these classes of ships, then what tends to happen is your attack class ships, while they have lots of firepower, are also the first ones to go down in a fight, and because of that, your firepower quickly diminishes over time. So having one of these per flotilla, and possibly two depending on the number of command points you're allowed, is very, very beneficial to providing maximum sustainability of your fleets. The second thing is you want to make sure that these guys are always outfitted for whatever your enemy is using weapon-wise. So if your enemy is using something like lots of missiles, then you want to make sure that you have flat cannons. Flat cannon for the counter to missiles. I'm not going to talk a lot about flat cannons in this video, but basically you need to know that for most missile class of weapons, if you have flat cannons, missiles do almost no damage. Flat cannons are extremely effective against all forms of torpedoes, and the more flat cannons you have, the more torpedoes do nothing. So be aware of that. If you're fighting torpedoes, use flat cannons. If you're fighting against flat cannons, do not use torpedoes. They're worthless against flat cannons. Swarm missiles are a little more effective, and combinations of swarm missiles with torpedoes can work. Also, if you just have a ton of torpedoes, even flat cannons won't defend you. But you got to have a lot of torpedoes in order to make that strategy typically work. If the enemy is using lots of laser weapons, the best defense against laser weapons, whether it be beams or lasers or both, is actually shields. Yes, that is true, but torpedoes are actually the laser weapons. If the enemy is not using any flat cannons at all, if they have 0 flat cannons on their fleet, torpedoes will actually destroy ships much faster at long range than lasers will deal damage in most cases. And because those ships do not have flak defenses, the torpedoes basically have a 100% chance to hit at long range. So ships that are outfitted with torpedoes and shields will survive very, very effectively against laser weapon ships. And then using blended defenses is also good, but it's never as effective. So Bob says, I mix my fleets when I have glass cannon attackers and generally run only attackers as Sophons, Unfallen, Vodyani, and Cravers in the early game. Every faction is going to have slightly different strategies that work better for them. As a general rule of thumb, offensive weapons outclass defensive modules significantly. And so having an extra gun versus having an extra set of plating or shielding is generally always preferable. The more damage that you have going out, the better. Plating and shielding does not give you enough health or defense to account for the damage of another weapon. It reduces the damage of weapons, but it's not as effective as just having another weapon in most cases. Fleets that can have more guns typically just win in this game. There are some ways to get around that, but it really depends on what they're building and how they're building it. I might make a separate video to talk a little bit more about fleet composition and weapon strategy, but right now I really want to focus on the chassis and what we can do with these and what the big differences between them are. And now we're getting to the most interesting part, because we're actually going to move up to the medium class. And this is our first medium class ship that we're going to talk about today. And this is the Hunter class. Every faction has a Hunter class. The Hunter is the offensive version of this ship. You can see that it has significantly more health than the previous class of ships. Even the Protector class ships don't have this much health. It has significantly more manpower, and so that can be very useful during invasions. Also useful in prolonging the 20% bonus to damage. And it costs 3 command points. So it does take up more of your fleet total. Now, there's something here on medium class ships that they added. This wasn't always here, I don't believe. Modules times 2. So it says when you add a module to a slot this ship, 2 modules will actually be equipped. So the power and cost is multiplied by the same amount. Now, this is only partially true. And let me show you what I mean by that. If I have a gun and I mouse over this gun and it shows 39 damage per second and I equip it, I'm actually getting significantly more than 39 damage per second. And that's because it's actually equipping 2 guns, and if you look at the character model, you can see there's actually 2 guns there, right? So put those guns, you can see the 2 guns. You can see the 2 streams of fire. So it's counting this as if it were 2 guns linked together, okay? And you can see when I mouse over here, my damage per second is now 95. Okay? Same thing with missiles. Damage per second, when I mouse over this, is 63. If I put this here, now it's 151. So damage on these modules is much greater than you would normally think. However, modules like this guy, lower chance to be targeted, 10, ship evasion 5. If I throw this in here, notice that the lower chance to be targeted and the ship evasion did not change. However, the cost of this is still double the cost of a single one. So it still costs twice as much to put this module in. It costs 4 adamantium instead of 2, and double the industry as what it says up here. And this is very confusing, and I wish it didn't do this. I wish that if I was in a medium class design, all of these would update to the actual amounts that are on the ship, but they don't. So the numbers are going to differ. So be aware that whatever you see up here when you mouse over is not always what you're going to see here, but what you see on the ship is what you're going to get. And in some cases, you may find that these modules are just not worth putting on bigger ships because of that. Now, I understand the reasoning for why they don't want to boost certain stats, specifically things like ship evasion or lowering the chance to be targeted. Doubling those numbers could have pretty big impacts on the game, especially when you're talking about a ship that's already got a ton of hit points. And so you can think of it like, because this ship is way more powerful, these stats kind of go a lot further, and that's why they're more expensive in a sense. But it's really random which ones get affected and which ones don't. For example, titanium slugs have siege damage. If you put a titanium slug module, you'll see that the cost is doubled, but also the siege damage is doubled. And so this is another great way to build very, very powerful fleets for sieging. Putting a bunch of siege modules on a ship like this. This has 14 and 14, that's going to be 28, and then 28 plus the 3 command points of siege. Basically, you're looking at 31 siege per turn from one ship. So pretty good. If you didn't know, the amount of siege that a typical ship has is equal to its command points. And I believe it's double its command points, actually. So that would be 6 plus whatever I counted here. 28 plus 6 would be like 34. But anyways, double your command points, but only if you have at least one weapon, which is weird. If you have a ship that doesn't have any weapons, you actually cannot blockade and you cannot siege. So fun fact there. Let's look at what the special bonuses are here. So this one will also focus fire with the other attack class ships, and it has targeting systems, which increases its damage by 20% on weapons, which is why when I doubled these values, it wasn't exactly what we were seeing on here, because we're getting double the value for 2 missiles, but then we're also multiplying that value by 20%. And then another 20% if your entire crew is intact. So the damage values that you see here aren't even the whole story. You also have damage modifiers from heroes and from certain laws that you can run. So there's a lot of things that come into play. Numbers are not always as clean as you would like them to be. And that's basically it for this medium class ship. The big thing that I want you to know about medium class ships is that the cost of these is significantly more than you would anticipate. And the values are typically doubled, but not always. And so it's very important that you check. For example, you might think, oh, 2% ship evasion and 4 movement should be 4% ship evasion and 8 movement if I throw it on here. But it's not. So keep that in mind. This is another one of those. This was a special module, Flotilla Protection. Notice the cost, 1,000 dust. If I put it in this ship, it's going to cost me 2,000 dust. But the values of those 10 and 10 do not actually go up. So this might be a module that I would prefer to put in a smaller class ship or a hero ship. So I could put obsolete weapons on my siege ships without decreasing their siege value. That is correct. Yeah, it just needs a weapon. So if you wanted to go show obsolete and find the cheapest available weapon, as long as it has any weapon in a weapon slot, and it has siege modules, you'll still be able to siege. You don't need to have a very powerful weapon. And in fact, a more powerful weapon for a siege ship really doesn't do a whole lot of good. 99% of the time when I'm building a siege ship, I will put a single flat cannon, and it's mainly not even to deal damage, it's more to protect that ship from missile fire than anything else. If those ships do happen to close into close range, flat cannons do reasonable amounts of damage, but more often than not, I'm relying on my protector class ships and my other fleets to deal with enemy threats in the sky. But yeah, if you were trying to min-max, you could throw an obsolete flat cannon on there, and then just put a bunch of titanium slug modules and get the maximum amount of siege for the cheapest amount of industry. Good question. Okay, let's look at the Sheridan class. This is the first class of ship that you get that have these special slots, which we'll talk briefly about. These are carrier class ships. And so these ones can actually carry fighters and bombers. They also tend to have a fair number of support module slots and defensive module slots. they don't tend to have as many weapon module slots as their medium class counterparts. So you might have noticed, I think we had up to 4 weapon slot modules on the medium class Hunter class ship for the United Empire. I only have 3 attack class modules on this class of ship. I have a lot more hit points, however, 9,500 hit points. And I have the same Guardian trait, which attracts fire to this ship, which can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on how you equip it. And then I get the bonus to defenses on this ship, plus 10% on plating and shields. So notice that the defensive bonus is not as good as the offensive bonus was for the other ship, which is another reason why I say offense is king. The best defense in space combat in Endless Space 2 is better offense. Get better weapons, get weapons that bypass the enemy's defenses, use optimal range tactics, but get your weapons in the most optimal and effective, and the more guns you can put on a ship, the better if you're trying to do combat. Doing lots of extra defenses at the expense of guns is never a good idea. For example, this weapon slot right here could also be used as a defensive slot. There is almost no situation where putting a defensive module in this slot is going to be better than putting a weapon in this slot. Almost zero. So, something to be aware of. And that's my personal opinion. I don't necessarily know that that is certain 100% of the time, but that is my feeling based on my experience in the game. Weapons just always outclass defenses. And so if like these modules, you have defense modules, you can't put anything else in them, you might as well put some defenses there. Great. But anytime you have an option between weapons and defense, weapons always should win. So, we can put our normal guns in this ship. We do have access to more modules, more support modules that are sometimes limited to this class of ship. And we have these fighters and bombers. Now, here's all you need to know about fighters and bombers. Don't mess with them too much at this point in the game. One of the things that you're going to be tempted to do as soon as you get these medium class ships is you're going to want to fill them with fighters and bombers and go into battle and watch all these ships fly around and then wonder why you're not doing any damage. And that is because these modules have very, very specific roles. Let's start with the first one that you should ever think about, and that is bombers. Bombers are effective at taking out large class ships. They're moderately effective at taking out medium class ships. They're pretty abysmal at taking out smaller class ships. They are significantly more effective against any ship that does not have flat cannons. Any ship that has flat cannons will likely shoot these things out of the sky, and so they won't be very effective against a lot of ship classes, particularly the bigger class ships decked out with lots of flat cannons. But I want to show you something. So if you mouse over this and then you mouse over this, you'll notice that the health of the ship is doubled because our ×2 multiplier is working. However, the number of ships is not doubled, nor is the dodge probability or some of these other statistics. So, once again, what you see on the module up here is not always what you get down here. You need to pay attention. This one, we see a squadron with a unit of 1. If I put this here, notice that I get a unit squadron of 2. So fighters actually do duplicate when you put it into this module, but bombers don't. Health does double. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what fighters are good for. Fighters have one use in the game. They're pretty bad against everything except for bombers. And so until your enemy starts using bombers against your large class ships, you really don't need to be using fighters. Large class ships get taken down by bombers. Large class ships defend against bombers with fighters. There's really no other scenario where those things are very useful. There is one scenario where they're kind of useful, although I still think there are better options. And that is, if you are in a fleet and you have 3 flotillas and the enemy is not able to populate a 3rd flotilla due to the small size of their force, what you can do is in that 3rd flotilla, you can put a single carrier ship with as many bombers as possible in that slot. Now this is very, very specific to this scenario, and it's hard to predict it because your enemy can always show up with more ships, in which case this is a very bad scenario for you. But you can put that single carrier ship in the 3rd flotilla where it basically cannot be attacked because none of the other ships can be in the 3rd flotilla because their fleet is not big enough. And what this allows you to do is bombers and fighters are effective at all ranges, and if there's nobody in their immediate flotilla, they will fly to the next flotilla and attack that one instead. And they're 100% effective accuracy-wise once they get there. It takes a little time for them to do that travel, but once they get there, they're actually contributing to the battle 100%. And that's a lot more effective than many weapons that you would use in the 3rd flotilla. Because of firing arcs and weapon ranges being really wonky between flotillas, a lot of times your weapons won't even be firing at the other fleet, even when it seems like they should be. Sometimes they're firing at non-optimal ranges. And so this is one way when you're attacking from different flotilla positions to get maximum effectiveness, using bombers. Yes, so this is exactly what I'm kind of talking about. Using that 3rd flotilla with a bunch of bombers can be very effective. It becomes less effective if the opponent puts any ships in that fleet, in that 3rd spot as well, because all of those ships are going to focus your carrier down unless you put other ships to defend it, which you can. But again, if you put a bunch of ships in that 3rd flotilla, they're typically unable to do significant firing on anything but maybe the middle flotilla. And even that with firing arcs and ranges is less than ideal. You would generally be much better off putting them either in the middle or the top flotilla. Putting as few ships as possible in the bottom 3rd flotilla just so you get the bonus for morale is useful. But until you have extremely large fleets on both sides, bombers is probably the most effective weapon you can throw in that fleet. Now, the other weapon that you could throw in that and still be very effective would be beams. And that's because with your modifiers to double damage and everything, beam weapons are effective at all ranges, and they have pretty decent firing arcs, and so beam weaponry in the 3rd flotilla is also pretty effective. The downside to beam weaponry exclusively in the 3rd flotilla is that you have no flak defenses for torpedoes, and so even a single ship with a few torpedoes in that 3rd flotilla against you will probably tear you to shreds. So it's an effective tactic as long as you are far enough ahead of your opponent, in which case they won't be able to populate that 3rd flotilla with ships because they don't have large enough fleets yet. Okay, I think we've talked enough about this. One more time just to reiterate, basically leave bombers alone until you start seeing large class ships. They're very effective against large class ships. They're moderately effective against medium class ships. They're pretty bad against everything else. Stay away from fighters until you see bombers. If your opponent is not using bombers against you, there is almost never a reason to take fighters. They're really bad. They're just not very good. And finally, the big daddy of them all, the Zelavis class carrier. This is the last class of basic ship type that you get. There are the Behemoth class ships that I'm not going to go over today, but there are a few points on this specific one that I want to cover. The first thing that we'll cover is this ship is a large class ship with modules times 4. So modules times 4 again means that sometimes your stats will be multiplied by 4 and sometimes they won't. In this case, fighters actually are multiplied by 4. So you actually get 4 fighters, you get 4 times the health, 4 times the damage. Pretty cool. Bombers, you get double the bombers, but you also get 4 times the health. So you get 2 bombers with a lot more health. Bigger bombers, I guess. A lot more damage as well. These ships provide extra health to your squadrons and veteran pilots, which deal extra damage. So if you are taking fighters and bombers, this is the ship that you want to be using those fighters and bombers in. The problem with that, in my opinion, is that because the 4 times damage on these weapon modules is so good, there's almost never a situation where fighters and bombers makes a lot of sense when you can just put lots of missiles and guns and lasers and just blow everybody else's ships up. So, we'll see. This class of ship with what is these Golgi lasers? I mean, look at the damage. Just ridiculous amounts of damage. Okay, and don't forget, these weapons have a 20% crit chance, so that's really high for a lot of weapons in the game at this point. What's going to survive this? Like, I don't care how many shields you have. I'm doing like 290 damage per second to your shields. And that doesn't include crit chance or some of the other damage modifiers that are going on with this. So, bombers don't make a lot of sense to me in this game. Another thing that I want to point out is that there's this extra large slot which actually has double the DPS. So this is a times 4 slot that is then double, which is basically a times 8 slot. So we had how many of these? 1, 2. That's the equivalent of 4, right? 145. Because this is times 4 and this is times 4, so that's the equivalent of 8. So if I put one of these here, that's the equivalent of 8 guns. That's a lot of damage. Now, there's a lot of discussion about what the best weapon to use in this slot is, and in my opinion, I think you are generally a fool if you don't put beams here. And the reason for that is beams are the only weapon that have 100% accuracy at all ranges, which means that times 8 damage is 100% effective. And because it's times 8 damage, essentially, beams actually deal reasonable amounts of damage, like a lot of damage. So we're talking 200 damage per second with 100% accuracy at all ranges. So that's very, very effective. Big, 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 big damage. There's not much else to these ships other than the fact that they're extremely expensive. And once again, when we're talking about support modules specifically, you're going to find that the cost of these modules is significant, but the actual values don't increase. So before you go throwing a bunch of these really cool support modules on here, always double check and see if the numbers are being multiplied by 4. And if not, you may want to reconsider the cost, unless you're just rolling in industry and dough and strategics, because it becomes very expensive to outfit these ships with lots of support modules. I guess the last thing that I'll point out on this particular ship is the carrier class has a hull weakness of 600. And that affects the amount of defense that you get from a single module. So you may remember when we were looking at our small class ships, a single defense module was actually granting like somewhere upwards of 50%, 55% defense against projectile weapons. Well, a single one on here, even though the defenses are significantly higher, the health bonus is higher, because of the way that that hull weakness works, your defenses don't work as well. And that's because we have such high hit point pools that if these worked equally well on these bigger class ships, they would basically be impossible to kill. So what they did was they made defenses even less useful, even less effective, I guess I should say. Which, once again, like, why would I ever put a defensive module in this slot for such a crappy amount of defense when I could just put a bigger laser and kill the ship faster? Like, it makes no sense. So never, ever, ever put defense modules in these slots if you have the option to put something else. If you have defensive module slots, yes, fill them up. If you have defensive module slots that have a support slot, I would almost always lean towards putting a support module in here. Because you're probably going to find more effective use of the support module. Something like this, times 4, gives it 28 extra sieging power. That's pretty helpful compared to slightly better defense. And then also remember that if I put one of these and I put another one, it doesn't go up to 50. It's not a linear relationship. So the more of these that I try to put in here, right, I could basically make this ship invincible. But it does no damage now. Like, I just have very, very little damage compared to, 63% reduction to damage from projectile weapons is a lot when you have this many hit points. It more than doubles your hit points, essentially. But it's just not worth it when I can just blow up all their ships by filling them out with guns. There were a couple other things that I wanted to look at. Let's talk about primary targets, I guess. So every class of ship has a primary and a secondary target. These things will be affected by the interference from Guardian class ships like Coordinators and Protectors. So even if your primary target is a carrier ship, if there's Guardians and Protectors, they're still going to attract some of your fire away from those ships. And then these modules that change the statistics slightly as well can throw things off a little bit. But I don't think there's much more to say about them than that. Every class of ship has different ones. I think that's pretty much it. So hopefully this was helpful. This was an hour-long video. I didn't expect it to go quite this long, but there was a lot of information here, and I talked about it as best I could. If you have any questions or thoughts, please leave them in the comment section, and I will try to address them as quickly as I can. But hopefully after doing this video, people will have a much better understanding of how to build their own ships in Endless Space 2 and how some of these menus and some of these stats interact with one another to give you the numbers that you actually see when you're in a battle. Until next time, happy hunting. This has been The Nose Plays, and you guys have a great day.